Good evening, everyone. Or maybe that should be good morning to some and perhaps almost good night to others. But wherever you are in the world, you're very welcome to this evening's lecture. My name is Sean Farren, and currently I'm chair of the John and Pat Hume Foundation. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's event, which marks European Day. It'll be no surprise to anyone that the foundation is marking European Day. From his very early years as a public figure, John Hume demonstrated just how passionate an advocate for the European project he was. He regarded it as the world's greatest example of peaceful change-making and reconciliation. And of course, he went on to serve as a member of the European Parliament for 25 years. He was inspired by the thinking behind the whole European project and by its institutional arrangements as these evolved and developed over the years. And all of this informed his approach to peacemaking and reconciliation in Ireland, North and South. This evening, we are inaugurating an annual Spirit of Peace lecture to mark John and Pat Hume's contribution. And we're very pleased that a very distinguished Irish and European public servant, David O'Sullivan, has accepted our invitation to deliver that lecture. To moderate the lecture, we are honoured to have Tony Connelly, European editor for RTE, Ireland's public service broadcaster. Tony has become very much a household name, especially over the last few years, as he helped guide us through the intricacies of the Brexit negotiations and now through its aftermath. So no better person to moderate this evening's proceedings. And I now invite Tony to take charge of proceedings from here on in. Tony, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean. My name is Tony Connelly, RTE Europe editor, as Sean pointed out there, and I'm absolutely delighted and honoured to be talking to David O'Sullivan for tonight's inaugural John Hume European Spirit of Peace lecture. David O'Sullivan, of course, served as EU ambassador to the United States from November 2014 until February 2019. Before that, he was the Chief Operating Officer for the European Union's External Action Service, its diplomatic arm. And previously, he held a number of senior positions with the European Commission, including Director General for Trade from 2005 to 2010, Secretary General of the European Commission 2000 to 2005, and Chief of Staff to Commission President Romano Prodi. Before joining the Commission, David started his career with the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade way back in 1977 to 1979. He's a graduate of Trinity College Dublin and the College of Europe in Bruges, where the Irish government hoped to be sending busloads of young, bright Irish civil servants who might follow in the footsteps of people like David in due course. He also holds honorary doctorates from the Dublin Institute of Technology and Trinity College Dublin. He was awarded the EU Transatlantic Business Award by the American Chamber of Commerce in 2014. In November of 2019, he joined the Brussels office of the law firm of Steptoe and Johnson as a senior counsellor. So I'm now delighted to be handing over to David O'Sullivan for his inaugural address of the Hume Foundation. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you, Sean, and good evening to all of you in Europe, and good morning to those of you, or good afternoon to those of you perhaps from across the Atlantic. I am indeed deeply honored to have been invited by the John and Pat Hume Foundation to deliver this address in honor of John's remarkable legacy in the service of peace and reconciliation. I mainly knew John during the time we shared in Strasbourg, where he was already such an impressive and influential figure. But I first heard of him many years ago when I was still at school. My father was working in military intelligence, not the oxymoron it is sometimes thought to be, And at an early stage in the growing unrest in Northern Ireland, he spent some time in Derry talking to local leaders, trying to understand what was going on. When he came home, he told me he had been deeply impressed by a young man called John Hume, who he explained was active in the credit union. A few months later, we were watching the RTE news, not with Tony, and John was being interviewed. "That's the fellow I told you about," my father said. "Mark my words, if ever we live to see a united Ireland, that man will be the first Prime Minister." It was not to be, of course, but John's influence and impact was perhaps even greater than if he had held high political office. He had a great passion about European integration, as he explained in his landmark speech accepting the Nobel Prize. And as Sean has pointed out, yesterday was Europe Day, and this year marks the 70th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Paris, establishing the coal and steel community, the first great step on the road that led to the creation of the European Union as we have it today. It has always been the procession of Echternach in Luxembourg, 3 steps forward and 2, or sometimes honestly, even 2.5 steps back. But the movement has always been forward, and few could have imagined in 1951 what we would have achieved 70 years later. Whenever I spoke about Europe in the United States, where the EU was often seen as a mere trading bloc, I usually started by saying that the EU had 3 fundamental objectives: peace, freedom, and prosperity. As John always recognized, the key driving force behind the creation of what we know today as the European Union was a desire for peace and reconciliation in Europe. After 2 world wars, started from European civil wars and the Holocaust, wise people in Europe decided that we needed a new business model for the continent, one which used reconciliation and the building of visible interdependence as a means of preventing future war. Thanks to this, we have gone nearly 70 years since the end of the Second World War without major power conflict on the continent of Europe. You must go back a very long way to find a comparable period of peace. Of course, many factors contributed to this: the Cold War, NATO, the relatively benign American hegemony. But without doubt, the single most important factor was the weaving of a tissue of interdependence, which started with the creation of the European coal and steel community, and which has progressively evolved into the European Union of today. The European Union was also conceived on the basis of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. This was partially enshrined in the founding treaties, but reinforced by the European Convention on Human Rights, which has since been integrated into European law. Membership of the European Community, as it was then known, became a beacon for countries emerging from totalitarianism. First Greece after the dictatorship of the colonels in 1981, then Spain and Portugal after Franco and Salazar in 1986, and finally, and probably Europe's greatest achievement, the reunification of the continent through the admission of the 10 former satellite states of the Soviet Union in 2004. I do not believe that the European Union can claim credit for the collapse of the Berlin Wall, but I do believe that the European Union and the process of enlargement, which drove the newly emerged countries of Central Europe towards a system of democracy and the rule of law, played a major role in ensuring that the collapse of the Soviet Union resulted not in chaos and conflict, but rather in the peaceful transition from totalitarian systems to liberal democracies. Finally, notwithstanding the ups and downs of the economic cycle, including the ravages of the Great Recession of 2008, the reality is that all the countries which have joined the European Union are much better off than would otherwise have been the case, including, by the way, the United Kingdom. All countries benefited from a huge increase in their overall prosperity. The creation of the single market in 1992 has been one of Europe's greatest achievements, driving greater competitiveness from the enormous economies of scale and creating an economic area comparable to that of the world's most important economic powers, such as China today and the United States. Today, the European Union ranks as one of the world's 3 most important economies. The introduction of the euro, now shared by 19 out of our 27 member states, has further consolidated an integrated market and is now the world's 2nd reserve currency. These achievements were made possible by an extremely innovative approach to imagining this new Europe. The founding fathers designed an institutional setup which is truly unique in international relations. The European Union has developed supranational institutions which are not replicated in any other international organization. There is the Council of Ministers, which brings all the member states around the same table. There is the European Parliament, which is the only directed elected parliamentary assembly in the world. And finally, most importantly, there is the European Commission, the truly unique element of the European integration process. The Commission is a body which simultaneously has the monopoly of power to propose legislation and the responsibility for the implementation and supervision of that legislation. It is an executive, but not a government. The founding fathers thereby created a decompression chamber designed to drive forward the process of integration by identifying the truly European interest in any proposal. The Commission has its failings and its flaws, but it remains central to the possibility of progress in European integration. The European Union has also created a unique supranational legal order in which European law remains the ultimate arbiter of what is right and wrong. This system is unique, not least because it relies on the acceptance by member states of something for which there is ultimately no coercive means of enforcement, the supremacy of European law over national law. This progress in European integration has been achieved, contrary to many popular representations, by fully respecting the sovereignty and the national identity of the member states. Anyone who travels around Europe clearly sees that while you do not have to show your passport or go through customs at the different frontiers you are passing, you are moving from one nation state to another. You hear it in the language, you see it in the buildings and in the food in the restaurants. Member states of the European Union retain a remarkable degree of sovereignty over issues which are of greatest importance to their citizens, whether this be education, healthcare systems, systems of government, or cultural identity. None are undermined or diminished by membership of a common European system. A common sense of belonging to Europe overlays and does not replace our national and even regional identities. I am not less of an Irishman for considering myself also European. This has meant the emergence of an entirely new and unprecedented supranational order, which has never been seen in human history. It's not a nation state. It is not even a multinational federation. It is a hybrid creation which President Delors once qualified as an unidentified political object. This often leads to criticism because there's no easy comparison with the traditional features of our member states. But it is precisely this hybrid arrangement which I believe the founding fathers, as they emerged from the ashes of the Second World War, sought to achieve. A structure in which national identity would be preserved, but which would build progressively a complex interweaving of common interests to ensure that these national interests would never again lead to destructive conflict. We have truly made the notion of war on this continent unthinkable. And as Sean said, I believe it was this vision which so inspired John in his ambition for what might be possible on the island of Ireland. An Ireland where we would not be condemned to live in perpetual conflict between different national identities, but rather one where we could allow each person to take full pride in those identities, in a context of mutual respect, and above all, with a political system with guardrails against our differences ever spilling over into violent conflict. Today, the European Union stands out as the most remarkable achievement of conflict resolution which the world has ever seen. We should never forget this, and we should be proud to be part of such an achievement. However, no structure, no matter how successful or how solidly built, can rest only on its past achievements. The key question facing us today is how the European will go forward in an increasingly complex world. And I say this as we move towards the world in which identity politics and an increasingly transactional view of international relations seems to be growing dangerously. The EU stands out as a post-Westphalian structure in an increasingly Hobbesian world. Against this backdrop, the von der Leyen Commission has set itself an extremely ambitious agenda across three main platforms. The first, and by far the most important, is that of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050, with an interim goal to reduce carbon emissions by 55% by 2030. The enormous significance of the new Green Deal for Europe cannot be overstated. It represents nothing less than a major economic and social revolution with huge consequences for all levels of society. The second agenda item is achieving the digital transition in the coming decade. And the third objective is that of creating a more geopolitical Europe, capable of playing a meaningful role in our rapidly changing environment. Of course, the most immediate challenge facing the European Union is the pandemic and its consequences. The pandemic is first and foremost, of course, a public health crisis. Many are critical of the way the Union has responded, and I cannot deny that some of those criticisms have justification. On the other hand, it should not be forgotten that public health was never a responsibility of the European Union, but rather one of those measures entirely reserved for the responsibility of member states. However, the COVID crisis demonstrated that in practice, it's extremely difficult for countries to manage this kind of situation without close cooperation with their neighbors. The European Union found itself increasingly thrust into the forefront in trying to find solutions. The vaccine rollout is a good example. It was never going to make sense to imagine 27 EU member states competing in a marketplace for vaccines. However, agreeing on how to organize joint procurement and then delivering vaccines in the quantities required was always going to be a big ask for an organization which had never undertaken a task like this before. The early stages of the process were frankly rocky, and it cannot be denied that the rollout was late to start due to shortfalls in the supply of vaccines and inadequate delivery logistics at the level of many member states. Clearly, mistakes were made, both at European and at national level, and lessons must be learned for the future, because this may not be our last pandemic, I fear. In the end, however, the system is now up and running, and there can be reasonable expectation that the gap between achieving the target of vaccinating 70% of the adult population in the EU and, say, in the UK or the US will be a matter of weeks. More complex will be the economic recovery. The Union had a great success last year in agreeing the multi-annual financial framework and the recovery fund, together totaling 1.8 trillion euros of investment. And for the first time ever, allowing the European Union to borrow on behalf of its member states. It will be vital to make the best use of this money in helping countries emerge from the lockdown and to overcome the many real economic problems which are going to result. Regarding the digital transition, there are many challenges ahead. We are facing a major industrial revolution with the arrival of the Internet of Things, 5 and 6G, artificial intelligence, and facial recognition. We know we must embrace the new technologies or run the risk of being left behind in the global race, while we're also aware of the many ethical and social choices which this brave new world will present us with. There are also hugely risky new vulnerabilities through cyber warfare, whether from state or non-state actors. The third objective is the role of Europe in the world, and this is arguably our most important challenge, but also our most difficult. The tectonic plates of the global order are shifting. The multilateral system of which the EU was an organic part is under unprecedented strain. The United States under Donald Trump proved itself an unreliable and frankly even hostile partner. The arrival of President Biden is a welcome return to the US of old, but we know that Trump 2.0 cannot be excluded for the future. We face a rising China, a revanchist Russia, and a dangerously unstable neighborhood from Eastern Europe to the Middle East. Africa is a continent full of potential, but also instability and risks. However, we still lack a sufficiently common understanding of how to tackle these challenges. The European Union is potentially a global actor. We're the largest trading bloc in the world. We're at the center of the largest free trade network the world has ever seen. We are the largest donor of development and humanitarian aid. We are a leader in the fight against climate change. Collectively, and not many people realize this, we have the second largest defense budget in the world. But we know that our differences over Russia, over China, over the neighborhood, hold us back from leveraging those assets into real influence. Do we have the will and the capacity to change that is the question. We have created a common diplomatic service and a common foreign minister, even if we refuse to call the role by that name. But do we really want to act together? Or do we sometimes prefer the luxury of our national positions, even if they have little impact in the real world? I honestly don't know the answer to that question, but it is one which is going to haunt us in the years to come. I could not speak to this audience in the memory of John Hume without mentioning Brexit, and I do so under the control of the greatest Brexit expert, Tony Connelly, of course. Brexit was always going to be very bad news for Ireland, both north and south. We knew that. For the Republic, despite the many tensions in the relationship, the United Kingdom has always been a very important EU partner. The similarities of the legal and administrative systems meant we were often on the same page regarding EU rules. Ireland shared the UK's generally free market economic approach, with the notable exception of the common agricultural policy on which we had to agree to disagree. The common travel area linked the Republic to the UK and made impossible the joining of Schengen. Economically speaking, while exports to the United Kingdom as a percentage of overall exports have been declining steadily since we joined the European Union, and currently only stand at around 11%, a disproportionate amount of indigenous Irish industry is still heavily dependent upon the UK market, while around 60 to 70% of Irish exports transit through the UK. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement between the UK and the EU, agreed in the dying days of last year, has removed the threat of tariffs for these industries, but has done little to address the inevitable non-tariff barriers which will arise due to the UK's departure from the single market and the customs union. For Northern Ireland, however, Brexit presented a particularly toxic set of problems. While it is not explicitly set out in the Good Friday Agreement, though there are passing references, the entire basis of the agreement is predicated on the assumption of joint membership of the European Union by Ireland and the United Kingdom. The departure of the UK from the EU ran a clear risk of upsetting that delicate balance. The Irish government and some UK politicians, notably Tony Blair and John Major, saw this threat coming even during the referendum campaign. Their repeated warnings were dismissed as another part of Project Fear. Even more bizarrely, the DUP threw itself fully behind Brexit, seemingly oblivious to the real risks that this could pose, not just to the Good Friday Agreement, but even to the Union itself. The debate about what to do about Northern Ireland hinged around the issue that Brexit, other than in its softest variant, meant that there would have to be a new form of border somewhere. There were only three possible choices: a border on the island of Ireland between North and South, a border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, or a border between the island of Ireland as a whole and the rest of the EU. That third option, which would have implied that the Republic of Ireland was forced to leave the single market and the customs union on foot of a UK decision, was never going to happen. There was general agreement both within Northern Ireland and between the governments of Ireland and the United Kingdom that reinstating some form of border infrastructure on the island of Ireland was likely to prove highly destabilizing to the fragile peace process established by the Good Friday Agreement. This essentially left only one practicable option, which was to install such border checks as were made necessary by the new situation at the ports and airports of Northern Ireland, where such infrastructure already existed and where it would be generally less visible and intrusive. Unless, of course, the UK had opted for a much softer version of Brexit, but this was ruled out from a very early stage. This was how we ended with the Northern Ireland Protocol. We must admit that the protocol is a peculiar animal. Northern Ireland continues to be a part of the EU single market and customs union while simultaneously remaining part of the UK internal market. Many of us trade specialists were genuinely perplexed by how this was going to work. There is no precedent in international trade law for such a situation. And despite Mr. Johnson's disingenuous protestations to the contrary, the basic premise of the protocol does require customs checks of some sort on Northern Ireland GB trade in both directions. The nature and intensity of these checks is a matter of detail and was largely left to the Joint Committee to thrash out. But there is no hiding the fact that even in a small way, Northern Ireland has become a semi-detached part of the UK. It is not at all surprising that unionists find this unsettling. On the other hand, we did not get here by accident. All the other options were exhausted. The problems of operating the protocol are many, and I'm sure there is greater scope for greater flexibility and pragmatism in fine-tuning the procedures. Common sense will be needed in abundance. On the other hand, there will be limits as to how far the EU side can go without provoking a backlash from member states genuinely worried about creating a vulnerable backdoor to the single market via Ireland. Above all, I believe that the United Kingdom government needs to take far greater ownership of what it has committed itself to in international law. We always feared that Brexit had the capacity to poison the situation in Northern Ireland. Unfortunately, we have not been disappointed. Given the difficulties and sensitivities associated with the operation of the protocol, I am among those who consider that raising the issue of possible reunification, and especially the prospect of an early border poll, is deeply unhelpful at this point. Reunification is a very legitimate objective, but somehow conflating the constitutional issue with the practical aspects of the protocol can only serve further to destabilize many in the unionist community. Regarding Ireland-UK relations more generally, Brexit has set us back many years, and I say that with deep sadness. I well remember the historic visit of the Queen in 2011. Honestly, I could never have imagined that in my lifetime I would see the Queen of England applauded on the streets of Dublin and Cork. I genuinely thought that we had finally laid the ghosts of our difficult past to rest. Brexit has reopened some of those old wounds, and we all need to work very hard to heal them over again. Relations between the UK and the EU look set to remain fraught for many years to come. The TCA has left many issues unresolved. There is likely to be a semi-permanent state of negotiation on a myriad of issues into the future. We've just solved the issue of data flows, but the fix is only temporary. The issue of financial services will be very contentious. And the tendency of the British government still to portray all discussions as doughty Britain battles hostile Brussels will not help. It looks as though Brexit, far from settling Britain's EU question, has simply transformed the context from one of an often isolated UK within the EU to that of an even more isolated UK outside. So where does all this leave us? The last 70 years of European integration have truly produced something quite remarkable. The EU is a sprightly 70-year-old. The Union has defied its critics and pulled through some very difficult crises in recent years. The Great Recession and the Greek Euro crisis, the refugee and migration crisis, Brexit and the rise of populism more generally. The EU has proven itself extremely resilient, and constant Anglo-Saxon speculation about its imminent demise have proven wildly exaggerated. However, there are many challenges ahead. It is far from certain that the institutions and structures which have served us so well in the last 70 years will continue to be fit for purpose in the new world in which we increasingly find ourselves. Internally, we have issues with member states such as Hungary and Poland who are drifting away from the principles and values we stand for: democracy, human rights, freedom of expression, the rule of law. We have unfinished business in the reform of the Eurozone. Externally, we have a new world threatened by climate change, facing an industrial and technological revolution of unprecedented proportions, and a high level of geopolitical instability as the multilateral institutions are increasingly threatened by the return of great power politics. For Europe to assert itself in this world will necessarily require us to work more closely together. No single European country can ever hope to be a real influence in a world dominated increasingly by large superpowers. Scale will count in the 21st century. In such a situation, closer European integration really is the only option. But we will also encounter the challenge that the benefits of collective action come with the risk that people will feel that decisions are being taken too remotely and without adequate consideration of their local interests. There's no perfect solution to this dilemma, but I hope that the Conference on the Future of Europe, which begins its work this week, will help us engage in a meaningful dialogue with people across Europe as to how we strike this crucial balance between the need for Europe to be able to act on important occasions as a single force, with the equally important need for decisions to be taken as closely as possible to the people most affected. My personal conviction in favor of a more integrated Europe came not from the College of Europe or even from my early days in the Commission, but rather from my time in Japan in the early 80s. The Japanese saw us as a continent with a great past, but ill-equipped for the future. Delors and the single market reversed that perception. I remain convinced that for us Europeans, the coming decade will be a race between closer integration and the risk of growing irrelevance in a world which is shaped by others and not by us. I'm sorry that John is no longer with us to tell us how he would like to see this dilemma resolved. Sadly, we no longer have access to his wisdom. I'm sure he would remind us of where we have come from as the inspiration from where we need to go. In his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize, which he shared with David Trimble, he said, "The peoples of Europe then created institutions which respected their diversity, a Council of Ministers, the European Commission, and the European Parliament, but allowed them to work together in their common and substantial economic interest. They spilt their sweat and not their blood, and by doing so, broke down the barriers of distrust of centuries, and the new Europe has evolved and is still evolving based on agreement and respect for difference." On another occasion, John also said, "We are much closer together in the world today than we ever were in the past. Given that it is a much smaller world, we are in a stronger position to shape that world. Let us create a world in which there is no longer any war or any conflict." Perhaps our greatest question in Europe today is no longer how we avoid fighting with each other, but rather how we come together to shape that better world, one based on acceptance of our differences, celebration of our diversity, and assertion of our values at home and abroad. Not simple, but viewed from whence we came 70 years ago, definitely doable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. That was a wonderful drone's eye view of Europe, past and present, and some challenging thoughts for the future. You mentioned John Hume there. Actually, by the way, I have asked people if they would like to pose questions, just to put your questions in the chat function there. Quite a few people have done that already. Thanks very much. I'll get to those questions shortly. But David, John Hume, of course, was a great believer in politics being the art of the possible. You touched there on the Northern Ireland Protocol. You talked about how unsettling it is for unionists. Unionists might say they're more than unsettled. They feel profoundly shaken by this, and we've seen the reactions by some loyalists on the streets of Belfast and Derry, and indeed Michel Barnier said in his book, which is just out, it doesn't take much to reignite violence. What do you think John Hume would say to the European Commission and member states today if he were able to convey to them how risky the situation is in Northern Ireland? And given the belief in the art of the possible, can a compromise be found that the European Commission would live with, that might not perfectly reflect the dogma of the single market, given that there is a duty of care by the European Union and the British government, and indeed the Irish government, for Northern Ireland?
Well, I think the European Commission, with the notable exception of the slip over Article 16, which was pretty disastrous for the short period it happened, has shown huge sensitivity. But I think, Tony, it's wrong to phrase it on the European Commission. It's the other member states. It's the integrity of the single market and the functioning of the single market that needs to be preserved. Now, I think there's plenty of flexibility that can be shown, but above all else, the British government has to take ownership of what they've signed up to. And I think part of the difficulty is their unwillingness to implement that in good faith, in the context of which you can then adjust at the margins and try and avoid situations where there's empty shelves on the supermarkets, or there is felt to be excessive observance of rules in the implementation. But the way in which the British government from the very beginning, and particularly Boris Johnson, kept saying, well, there aren't going to be any checks, so what's all this? All nonsense. This has fueled the situation. I perfectly get the sense of betrayal that are felt by many unionists, but the sense of betrayal should be with Boris Johnson and the British government. If they had wanted to to prioritize the integrity of the United Kingdom, they could have stayed inside the customs union. They could have stayed inside the single market. Even today, they could conclude an agreement on food standards and veterinary standards, which would eliminate many of the checks which are currently brought about by their unwillingness to do that. So there are as many answers in the hands of the British government in this situation as there are in the hands of the European Commission. But yes, I think there is a very high recognition in Europe of the risks and a willingness to make compromises in order to avoid the risk of violence reemerging. But really, it does take two, and the notion that all the responsibility is with the EU and the European Commission is highly misplaced, in my view.
I mean, you're right in that it takes two in this situation, and we all know it's been so well documented that the British government, or certainly Vote Leave and the General Leave side, did not pay enough or any attention to the implications for Ireland, North and South. And there the fault lies. And we can also ascribe blame to Boris Johnson. But in a sense, that's in the past. We are where we are at the moment, and we are facing into wholesale rejection of the protocol, rightly or wrongly. It's still a very dicey situation. I mean, if the British government and British officials I speak to say, look, how can Lincolnshire sausages coming into Northern Ireland pose an existential threat to the single market? Have they not got a point?
Well, they have a point when you put it in that way now, but we're talking about something which is going to go on for many years. So I think, again, the issue of moratoriums or suspension of checks was very much on the table. There were periods agreed. There can be extensions of those. So I think there's no lack. My experience, Tony, is that the European Commission is infinitely creative when it comes to finding solutions. But you need a partner on the other side of the table who is genuinely engaged in accepting the basic premise of the protocol. And the suspicion for many on the European side, as you know, is that the UK is kind of leveraging some of this stuff for other reasons.
And of course, the more they might want to diverge themselves from EU norms for whatever reason,
exactly,
the harder that makes the Irish Sea border.
Exactly. And so, the Lincolnshire sausages now may be entirely compatible with single market rules because they've only just left. Will that be the case in a year's time or 2 years' time if the Lincolnshire sausages are being imported with, sausage pig meat from the United States? I don't know. But I mean, those are the kind of issues. But I really think that it is perfectly possible to have a pragmatic agreement on managing this in the current situation. But it does require the UK government to accept that they have responsibilities, they have taken commitments, and as long as they retain the wish to derogate from or to move away from European standards, they are requiring checks. And the question of, okay, you can say we don't do checks for the first 6 months, or the first 9 months, but sooner or later you're going to have to do checks because you have no guarantee that those products are in conformity 9 months down the road, while that might be the case today.
Given your deep knowledge and contacts in the United States as EU ambassador there, and also your time at the head of DG Trade, the European Commission's trade division, what's your best guess on when the Biden administration will strike a trade agreement with the United Kingdom, and what impact would that have in this conversation?
Well, I think it's likely to happen, but I also think it's not likely to happen very soon. I mean, Trade Promotion Authority, which is the sort of fast track authority US administration needs to negotiate with the guarantee that Congress will not seek to renegotiate every comma and paragraph of a trade deal, expires in June. It's unlikely to be renewed, and basically you cannot have a trade negotiation in the absence of TPA. So I don't think this administration is looking at any new trade deals of any kind, probably this side of, certainly not this side of the midterms, and in my view, probably not this side of the next general election. So I think we're looking at 23, 24, and possibly 25. I do think it will happen eventually, but I think it's going to take some time.
And as Irish people often look to the Biden administration and Congress as well to keep an eye out for the protocol in Ireland. Is that in any sense fanciful, or do you think there is genuine determination in Congress vis-a-vis the Irish border and the Northern Ireland protocol?
Yeah, I think there is very strong feelings. President Biden personally, the Friends of Ireland, Richie Neal, Tom King and others, they are deeply attached to the Good Friday Agreement and to the process of peace in Northern Ireland, which they feel America is a stakeholder in. After all, it was George Mitchell and the Clintons who were very supportive of the whole process. So I think they will take a big interest in this. I mean, they will also not want to get caught in the middle of what they see as a squabble between the UK and the European Union. So they're going to be trying to balance those two things, a strong commitment to the Good Friday Agreement, but trying to stay out of the detail of managing something like the protocol. So I think that would be the general approach. So I think we should not expect the Americans to come and solve our problems for us. We have to solve them between Irish people and between the UK and the EU.
Thanks, David. Now I'm going to go to questions, and Adrian, who was the first up with a question, I don't know Adrian's second name, but he has asked, how can the EU be a foundation for peace when the Balkans conflict blew up in the 1990s? I mean, I think you were here possibly at the time, David. You know, a very dark and disturbing failure, I think, of EU statecraft at the time, such a conflagration right on Europe's borders.
Yes, it was a deeply upsetting and a terrible moment, Srebrenica and many other horrible events. But at a certain moment, if people decide they want to engage in violent conflict with each other, it's very difficult to stop. I mean, you know, unless you're prepared to actually send in troops and try to intervene. In the end, NATO did with the bombing, but it was very controversial. Balkans is a very complicated situation, which has defied statecraft for hundreds of years.
And I think possibly Germany recognizing Croatia sort of out of the traps quite quickly, that didn't help, I don't think.
It didn't, and it unfortunately there was a kind of throwback to historic connections. But I'm just saying that the Balkans has traditionally been a very difficult area. You know, we would have wished to do better, but on the other hand, that's why I was very careful in what I said in my talk. I said we have avoided great power conflict. We have not avoided all conflict on the continent of Europe, indeed. And the Balkans was one such failure. I think in the meantime, we are now trying to play a much more helpful role. It's still a complicated part of the world with no easy solutions. And I think we still have some way to go before we solve all the problems of that region.
Great question in from Gordon Clark. If or when Scotland becomes peacefully independent, says Gordon, to what extent will member states facilitate its rapid accession? I thought we were getting away from Brexit, but obviously not much to my delight. And indeed reintegration into the EU. That's going to be a big question now, I think, David, for the next while.
Yeah, hi Gordon, nice to hear from you. Look, let's have an independent Scotland. I mean, we have a way to go before we get to that point, and let's let the British people decide if that's what they want, how this is going to work out, how you interpret the results of the Scottish elections. You've got the constitutional situation, which requires Westminster to agree. So I think it's not up to the EU to run ahead of itself in kind of saying we will welcome an independent Scotland. We don't yet know there is one. All things being equal, if ever there were to be an independent Scotland and it wanted to join the EU, I think it would be very well qualified to do so. But I think we're not there yet. And I really think it is not the place of the European Union to play a role in that discussion. We need to let the politics of the United Kingdom play out, and then we will see what emerges and what role Europe plays with whatever happens.
Yeah, I think the EU would probably be studiously neutral, as you say, but just as something of a footnote, if that's the right way to put it, I think Scotland was pushing quite hard, or certainly Scottish National Party was pushing hard for Scotland to get something like the same status or recognition as Northern Ireland. in the negotiations for the withdrawal agreement. I don't know, were you familiar with some of that thinking, how that went down?
I've heard it. I was a bit perplexed by it because I think it would be difficult to replicate or to have a comparison between the two situations. But yes, I'm aware that some people in Scotland raised that issue. Yes.
Question from Sean Farren himself. Is Brexit a one-off, or are states like Hungary likely to pose a threat to the EU's cohesion? You mentioned this in your speech about the rule of law regarding Hungary and Poland, but it's been very difficult for the EU politically to manage the Hungary question, not least of all the European People's Party, of which Viktor Orban's Fidesz party was a member. I mean, a lot of people were outraged at how long that behavior was tolerated. And I say that in as neutral a way as possible, given the professed values and aims of the European Union.
No, I would agree. I think this is probably one of the most difficult questions we are going to face. I mean, to Sean's immediate starting point, which is Brexit, a one-off? I think, relatively speaking, yes, Brexit is a one-off. I think the conditions around the UK were very specific. The problem with Hungary is not that it wants to leave, but perhaps that it wants to stay, and therefore, but stay on terms which are not necessarily acceptable to the rest of us. How we, when we had the enlargement of 2004, and it was such a momentous occasion. I remember being in Áras an Uachtaráin on the 1st of May 2004, and the wonderful ceremony with Mary McAleese presiding over the raising of the flags, a great sense of achievement, of kind of finally laying to rest the ghosts of the division of Europe. I don't think any of us ever were really spending a lot of time worrying about the fact that some of these countries might, in the end, kind of depart from the democratic rule of law path on which they were so clearly engaged in order to join. Article 7 was there, but it was more a kind of, emergency clause that no one thought we'd have to use. Now we are faced with a very real situation. And I agree with you. I think we were far too slow to react to what happened in Hungary. We should have reacted much sooner and much more aggressively. And I think we have to send a very strong message to Poland, though I'm more optimistic about Poland because there's still a civil society, there's still an opposition, there's still a debate in Poland. In Hungary, it's been extinguished. I mean, it's almost, you can argue that it's no longer a completely functioning democracy with the restrictions.
And is that the fault of the European Commission, or the fault of individual member states who, or is it the fault of a structure that just makes it very difficult to take stern action against a member state?
It's a mixture of all three, if we're completely honest. I mean, the member states were certainly not encouraging the Commission. The Commission was slow to pick up on the sort of legal tricks that the Hungarians were using, because they were very clever. When the Commission would object to a law, they would tweak it just enough to make the Commission feel they didn't have a basis for objecting, but it was still moving in the same direction. So in fairness to Orban, he was very clever in the way he went about this. But I think it was a collective failure of member states, of the Commission in its responsibility as guardian of the treaty, but also, as you say, very much of the EPP. Frankly, I think the EPP let itself down by being so tolerant of Viktor Orban's behavior, and only, at a very late moment, really moving to express disapproval, because this is deeply worrying. How can we are nothing if we are not a union of values. And this is fundamental to what the European Union stands for. So this is a big challenge. And Article 7, unfortunately, as you know, requires unanimity of all countries except the one in the dock. And when you have two countries, such as we have now with Poland and with Hungary, who kind of support each other and effectively block any action against the other, I think this really requires us to rethink whether we should not be better equipped to deal with that kind of situation in the future.
And the Council of the Conference on the Future of Europe could be the place to do that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. We have a question from Catherine Shannon on Scotland again. You can probably just give a fairly brief answer on this, because there's so many questions coming in. You think an independent Scotland linked to Northern Ireland and the Republic within the EU and the single market might be a force for reconciliation and greater prosperity for all three entities?
Look, if there were to be an independent Scotland, and I really put if, then I think logically that should find itself inside the European Union in the same spirit that we would love to see. We've always wanted the UK in the European Union. If we can't have the whole of the UK, if the UK eventually breaks up into constituent parts, as many of the constituent parts as want to be part of the European Union should be.
Okay, thank you for that. Question now from Vessel Badenhorst. In which new areas should EU competences be established? And he suggests either public housing or public health. You mentioned the pandemic in your speech. Just as a preamble to your response here, the European Movement Ireland, I think you may have seen, had a poll recently, a Red C poll on Irish attitudes to the EU. A lot of people unhappy with the way the EU responded to the pandemic and the vaccination rollout, but also very few people willing to give the EU more competences in public health. There's a clear paradox there, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't think you kind of start with the issue of competences. You start with outcomes. Why do we have, for example, with the migration crisis, why did we have the creation of Frontex, the frontier patrol force? Because individual member states clearly were not equipped to deal with the massive influx of refugees and asylum seekers which they were faced with. It's clear to me that to deal with a future pandemic, we do need a greater capacity to do certain things in the public health field at European level. It's not a question of the European Union taking over responsibility for public health, but there are certain things that the European Union should be empowered to do. So I think you need to start with outcomes. What delivers better results when done collectively than done individually? And that's how you need to work through to this. So I think if you ask people in the abstract, do you think the European Union should be responsible for public health? The answer is naturally no. I would say no. Do I think that the European Union should potentially have a certain role to play in a public health crisis across the European Union? Then the answer for me is definitely yes, and then you define it.
Okay, question now from Francis Jacobs on the Conference on the Future of Europe. He's wondering, is it going to be just a box ticking exercise, or could it have greater significance? Will it consult the usual suspects, or can EU citizens be more closely involved? I mean, I've done some reporting on this, and it looks like they genuinely are trying to gather the views and canvass the views of citizens through this digital platform. But as somebody said on Twitter, after about 3 seconds, and then they'll just disregard those views. I mean, how do you reconcile that need to have sort of executive improvements to the way the EU works and, you know, take cognizance of a huge range of opinions?
Yeah, no, it's why I kind of posed the challenge in my talk, because I think this is the difficult issue. We've been here once before. We had the Constitutional Convention in 2003, which produced the Constitution, which, as you know, fell at the first hurdle of a referendum in France, and then subsequently in the Netherlands. My own view about this is the following, and maybe it's a bit controversial, but I think governments are too timid in being willing really to talk about the future of Europe. I think one of the problems we have about Europe is the unwillingness of many national governments to adequately to explain to citizens why you need to do certain things at the European level, and why that is more effective than doing it at the national level. The tendency, which I sometimes call the Europeanization of failure and the nationalization of success, is to attribute to anything that goes well a national origin, and to attribute that anything that's not going so well, say, well, actually, that was the result of Brussels and Europe, and there was nothing we could do about it. And the vaccine rollout is a little bit a case in point, right? And yeah, details now, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Yeah.
I really think we need a much more honest discussion between us all, governments, citizens, and the European institutions, about why it is vital for this continent to do certain things at the European level. Otherwise, we will become totally irrelevant. Now, you need to minimize that and to maximize the sovereignty and the independence and the autonomy of nation states and the local level. I agree completely. But there are things where we need more pooling of sovereignty, and we should not be afraid to admit that. I think national politicians find it very difficult to admit that they can't solve all problems. They actually need another level to solve them. And I think that has to be the starting point, because I see governments running away from the idea of treaty change because they think, oh, you have to have a referendum and we'll never get it through. But if we can't have this frank discussion, I really fear that this continent will simply become bypassed by the world which is going to be created by the United States, by China, by other actors who are much more ruthless in their management of these situations than we are capable of being because of the way we're organized.
Of course, I think it bears repeating that when I arrived, a few years after I arrived in Brussels, and you'll recall this very well, David, there was the Convention on the Future of Europe, which drew in all the stakeholders and political parties and MEPs and NGOs and civil society, and they slaved over a thing called the EU Constitution. And at the first hurdle, it was shot down by voters in France and the Netherlands. Is that problem just kind of baked into the way Europeans think and act?
Well, I think, again, obviously we need to learn from that experience, and I understand why many national politicians are nervous about repeating the process. But again, I think you need a much more frank and honest debate. Even the Constitution was kind of dressed up as not really changing anything, right? It was sort of, it's just a repackaging exercise, and don't worry, everything remains the same. Everything can't remain the same. We are faced with the dramatic impact of climate change, the dramatic impact of the technological revolution, the Internet of Things, the artificial intelligence. We're on the cusp of dramatic changes. We cannot manage those other than collectively as Europeans. Any country doing it will be completely irrelevant. Now, are we telling people that? Are we being honest with people that we can only do this in a way that pools sovereignty at European level? That, to me, is, at the end of the day, the discussion we need to be having. Because I perfectly agree that decisions should be taken at the level closest to the people. I absolutely accept there are issues of legitimacy, of democracy, of transparency, all of those issues. But there's also issues of effectiveness and the ability of Europe actually to shape the world in which we're going to live, rather than simply find ourselves at the receiving end of a world shaped by the Chinese and the Americans.
Thanks very much, David. Quick question. Well, it's a couple of questions from Scott Jennings, but I'll just paraphrase what he's getting at. This is getting back to the Scottish question, and he's kind of linked it to unionist fears over the protocol. Scottish independence would clearly take away one of the sort of pillars of the United Kingdom, and perhaps as well the rationale of unionism in Northern Ireland, or part of the rationale, and that casts Irish unification in a whole new light of possibility or probability, whatever way you want to look at it. Let's just go down that particular rabbit hole for a second. How would the EU respond in that situation?
Well, I don't think it's for the EU to respond. I mean, firstly, there's so many hypotheticals in that, right? Is Scotland going to become independent? That's a big question. We've already dealt with it. What would that then do to the thinking of the unionist community in Northern Ireland? Would it make them think differently about possible reunification? Maybe, I don't know. But there are so many problems, Tony, that we need to deal with today. I think precisely we shouldn't be going down these rabbit holes. We have to reassure people in Northern Ireland that the protocol is not about the constitutional position of Northern Ireland. It is about finding pragmatic solutions to a very real issue triggered by the departure of the United Kingdom from the single market and from the customs union. And that we need to do that in a way which is proportionate, but which does give the guarantees which are needed to protect the integrity of the single market and to avoid building border infrastructure on the land of Ireland, which everyone agrees is not going to work. But we need to do that, and let's do that, and let's not then be running ahead to talk about border polls and reunification and Scottish independence. Let's see where these things end up in due course. Let's deal with today's problems, which are real, and the sensitivities of the unionist community. Let us try and reassure them, find solutions, make this thing work, and then let the politics play itself out. There are elections for the leadership of the DUP, the UUP. Clearly, Ulster Unionism is going through some moments of reflection. They understand that this has all been deeply destabilizing. The future of the UK is on the line, I agree. But let us not run ahead of ourselves, and let's try and deal with the problems which we can solve today and in the coming weeks, and let the other problems evolve in due course.
Well, David, you'll be delighted to hear a question now from Rory Montgomery, who, of course, you'll know well, and who was one of the Irish diplomats at the heart of creating what we now know as the Northern Ireland Protocol. But he's wondering, is Ireland's cautious approach to future European integration realistic, too unimaginative and conservative, or both, or all three, I think?
Yeah, I think those were words I may have used to Rory when he was representing the Irish government. Look, I do think Ireland has generally been a little too hesitant in engaging in the debate on what the future of Europe really is, and the real relationship of sovereignty, the pooling of sovereignty in a global context that is rapidly changing. I think we have been a bit timid. I think we need to step back from that. We need to think about security, defense, taxation, all these issues, because these are real questions which need to be addressed. And I think our future is inextricably linked to the success of the European Union. You know, we need to be fully engaged in that process. Of course, we're entitled to have our views, to have our reticences, to have our red lines and so on. But we need to do that in a context that nobody doubts our fundamental commitment to trying to make the whole thing succeed. Because if it doesn't, we will be at, you know, it's the smaller countries are going to lose out the most in the first phase.
And are you convinced that Irish support for membership will continue to sail forward at those sort of lofty heights as we've seen, given that we will over time, and already actually we are a net contributor? Do you think that that will start to make people question a bit the rights and wrongs?
Dear me, Tony, I hope we're not so small-minded that it's a question of, you know, the net contribution that decides it, because we're net beneficiaries from the whole project. Let's be clear. If you take an accounting view of transfers, yes, there were times when we were receiving a lot more money, but we are still a net beneficiary from the whole project when you total up all the benefits. I don't think that Irish support for European integration is a given at high levels. Because I think we do need constantly to remind people of what this is about and of the stakes which are there. I go back to the issue of security and defense. Charlie Haughey famously said, we're neutral, we just haven't decided who we're neutral against. I mean, you know, why are we so reluctant about this? Whose side do we think we are on in a global discussion about these security issues? Why would we be so reluctant to see Europe playing a role in the defense of the territory of our partner countries? Why would we take a very restrictive view in certain other issues? I think we need to be much more clear about what the real benefits of membership of the European Union are for Ireland, and for the fact that, yes, in a process of pooling of sovereignty, you don't win on everything all the time. There are trade-offs and there are choices to be made. And again, I think we are not always as honest with people as we need to be about this, so that they understand that it's not just one way. You can't only sell the EU as only having good things, because it's not true. There will be downsides. There will be certain restrictions on things you can do and can't do because you get the benefits that others are restricted in that. And that, I think, is something which needs a much wider public debate. I think the Irish Council of the European Movement, by the way, is doing a great job on that. I think many government ministers are trying, but I think we need a much more open and frank discussion.
And I think, to be fair, some of the findings of the Red Sea poll recently did suggest, a steady uptick in the number of people who do believe in a European defence and even also a United States defence involvement in Europe. So that's a debate, obviously, that will continue. I have a question now from Mr. Sean Klein, full disclosure, close friend of mine and godfather to my 14-year-old, soon to be 14-year-old. Sean wants to know, what might an independent Scotland mean for the EU? Now, you've talked about not jumping to hypotheticals, but looking at it from the other angle, could the EU benefit from an independent Scotland, perhaps in the sense that, given that Scotland is aligned with the acquis right up until January 1st, it would be a rather smooth process getting in. Scotland would bring a lot of assets and capabilities to the European project, one might say.
Yeah, sure, but that assumes an independent Scotland, and we don't yet have an independent Scotland. So, and I think to ask that question is to put the cart before the horse. The first question is, what constitutional arrangements do the people of the United Kingdom want for their future development? And is that an independent Scotland? Is it a Scotland with maximum devolution, a kind of home rule solution as was proposed here in the beginning of the 20th century? Or is it independence, or is it the status quo? I don't know. And I think the people of the United Kingdom should be left to sort this out for themselves, and the European Union will respond to whatever emerges from that. And if that is an independent Scotland, I think they would have a very, very good case for saying that they should be a member of the European Union. Yes, of course.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay, we're getting a little bit close to, well, we've gone beyond the sort of the roughly allotted time period, but I'll try and get through a few more questions. We have a question from Blair Horan, thankfully non-Brexit and non-Scotland related. Is China a threat to peace because of possible actions in Asia in the next 2 decades from an EU perspective?
Well, I hope that China is not a threat to peace, but definitely the rise of China and the choosing of China's place in the global commons is probably one of the most challenging questions we face, the world faces in the 21st century. Getting this right is going to be hugely difficult. I used to belong very much to the school of thinking of Chris Patton, who used to say the only thing that should worry us more than a successful China would be an unsuccessful China. Not because I thought China would rapidly become a democracy or embrace European ideas of rule of law and human rights, but because I thought China would find a comfortable place in the concert of nations. I think China is evolving. One of the things that worries me is the fact that previously you had a change of hierarchy every 10 years, and every 5 years you had the party congress that announced who would be the leader. So you had a renewal of the leadership. Xi Jinping as president for life, that always sends a shiver down my back, right? Anyone who announces themselves president for life of anything. I think this should worry us. I think the situation in Taiwan should worry us. But I do think we need to find an accommodation with China, and we should not start out on a road of confrontation, because we know how that ends. So getting the balance right between pushing back with China on many of the things we dislike, whether that's human rights, economic practice, behavior in the region, South China Sea, all of that, while at the same time engaging with them and making China feel that they have a stake in global governance, that they have a stake in peace and in accommodation at the international level is one of the big challenges. And it's one of the big debates or discussions we have to have with the United States, because I think ideally we should do this jointly with the United States, but we have to get on the same page. And there is a risk that the Americans will be much more prone to the confrontational approach, which could end very badly if mismanaged.
But I mean, honestly, though, does the European soft power when it comes to China really work? Because is it not becoming an uncomfortable fact of life in the early to mid 21st century that soft power doesn't work with actors like Russia and China? They don't care. They don't care about the international norms. They will take what they can get, and then they'll rip up the instructions and everyone then has to react, like with Crimea, like with Ukraine. And in that context as well, just as a supplementary question, do you think the European Union was mistaken in concluding the trade and investment agreement with China just, I think, before Christmas?
Well, I wouldn't compare China and Russia. I think Russia is, under Putin, is infinitely more dangerous to sort of peace and stability on the European continent, because Putin has annexed Crimea, is actively stirring things up in a number of the neighboring countries, eastern Ukraine. So is a much more malicious actor. China, you know, they're still trying to feel their way. They have many domestic vulnerabilities, environmental issues, demographic issues. We tend to think of China as this all-powerful bloc. They are worried, scared to death it's all going to fall apart, which explains to a certain extent some of the internal repression and the desire for control of the Communist Party. But I mean, your point, Tony, is it's not a question of soft power, but it's a question of stopping short of thinking that the only thing that works is military power, because I don't think that is what works. I'm not suggesting that we are soft. I am suggesting that we get a blend of toughness in areas which are very important, with a willingness to engage and an attempt to co-opt China into some kind of global governance, which I think they would like. I think China wants to be taken as a partner. Can they be completely trusted under a regime where you have a president for life? I don't know. That we have to test. But I certainly...
And the investment agreement, do you think that was a step in the right direction?
Look, I think this is, you know, grossly overplayed. Firstly, it's not even signed. It was an agreement which was achieved politically. We've been negotiating for 7 years, this agreement. By the way, the Americans are negotiating an identical agreement and had partially concluded it under what was called the Phase 1 agreement with Trump. So much of what is in the text that was agreed at the end of the year with China was simply catching up with what the Americans had already achieved. So I think there's no reason why we would not continue to engage on economic issues and seek to improve the economic situation. It doesn't mean that we agree with everything that China is doing. It doesn't mean that we approve of what they're doing in Hong Kong or elsewhere. But if you take the view that if you disagree with them about something, you will not cooperate on anything, how are we going to make a success of climate change? How are we going to make a success of COP26? So I come back to my point. Sorry, I sound like a broken record. It's a question of getting the mix right between being very tough on issues where we have problems and a willingness to engage, because in my view you need that blend. If you go only in the direction of accommodation, then it becomes appeasement. I agree, but if you go only in the direction of confrontation, therein lies, in my view, a very unhappy ending if we're not very careful.
Okay, well, you're answering and taking on some of the great challenging global questions of our time, David. Thanks very much. I'll maybe just try and squeeze a few more questions in because there's so many coming in. Great question from Greta McTague, who lives just on the other side of the border from Derry. I can probably answer this one if you want to sit this one out. I work in Derry, live in Donegal. Should I move to Derry or change jobs to work and to live in the EU? Is my current situation sustainable? So there's Greta basically wants you to figure out the rest of her working life for her.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are some personal choices there, Greta, but I genuinely think that what we have tried to do with the protocol and with the arrangements on the island of Ireland is, as far as possible, to preserve the sort of status quo where you can be British or Irish, you can live in the north, work in the south, you can live in the south, work in the north. All of that is still guaranteed either by EU law or by the common travel arrangements and the bilateral arrangements between the UK and Ireland. So I think that is what people have tried to do with the protocol and with all the other bits and pieces of legislation that govern those situations. So I hope you don't have to make that choice, whether you could continue to do as you do now, if that's what suits you personally. And you
okay, thanks for that, David. A quick question now from Maithri and Paul Dundas, who got the pronunciation correct there. Does fake news and increased political tribalism pose a threat to democracy in the EU? Yeah, mate, we haven't got into this yet, but how does the European Union deal with such a kind of slippery problem as fake news, given that no doubt European institutions are vulnerable to that kind of sort of invisible, insidious attack over time?
Well, look, I think we have a bit of a crisis of democracy in the West. We have it in the United States, we have it in Europe, where people are to a certain extent losing faith in democratic institutions. They don't feel it delivers for them in the right way, rightly or wrongly, but that's their perception. And an increasing tendency in elections to sort of vote none of the above, right? Whatever we've tried before, right? Throw them out, put somebody else in. And fake news and the undermining of facts is an integral part of that. And the thing I worry most about for the future of this continent and for the transatlantic alliance and for democracy and the rule of law is our inability to agree that there are such things as facts, and there is truth and there is untruth. And if you can't agree that, I mean, you can disagree about how you interpret the facts, you can disagree, but if you can't even agree on the fact that there is such a thing as objective facts, there is truth. We have a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, frankly, who freely feels able to just speak lies. Donald Trump spoke, lies every 5 minutes. This is deeply disturbing. I mean, and that's a problem. And I'd love to say I have the answer. The European institutions certainly don't have the answer. But this is a crisis of our democracy, and we need to address it. And it's very pervasive, and it's to be found in many different places and many different forms. And the fake news, or the sort of bots on Facebook and all this kind of, it's just a further manifestation of it. The ability of Russia or other state actors to destabilize our societies by simply playing on the gullibility of people and the willingness of people to believe in conspiracy theories, whether it's about vaccines or COVID or whatever. This is deeply corrosive. And yes, that worries me more than almost anything.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the EU does intend to try and counteract that a bit more aggressively at EU level, and possibly through the Conference on the Future of Europe. A question now from Mark Durkan, former leader of the SDLP. Given the EU's commitment to the Good Friday Agreement in all its parts, would there be room for the applied use of machinery in strands 2 and 3 as channels for vouchable equivalence or alignment in specific sectoral areas as a possible way of obviating some of the difficulties attached to the protocol? This is an idea that comes up now and again, David, but is there scope within the framework of those other strands of the Good Friday Agreement that could come into play here?
Well, look, I can't speak for the European Commission. I know Maros Šefčovič very well, and he's a very good guy. And I can assure you, if there are creative ways in which we can make things work better, this will be explored. And I think we should be open to creative ways. But we do have to bear in mind that there are 26 member states out there who have very legitimate concerns about the integrity of the single market. And their views have to be taken into account. So this is not something that can just be sorted out between us, in a sort of clandestine way. It has to be very openly debated. But yes, I am sure that if we get into a situation in which the British government fully accepts what it has signed up to and fully accepts that it must implement it, that then from that starting point, you can move to find creative solutions to lessen the intrusiveness of the checks and the restrictions, to increase the recognition of equivalence where that is justified and where that provides guarantees for the integrity of the single market. But the starting point has to be a willingness of the British government to be much more open and honest about what they actually agreed to in this protocol.
Okay, thanks, David. Just a clarification from Noelle O'Connell from the European Movement there on that Red Sea poll. She's clarified that 78% polled of Irish voters agreed that the US should remain an important ally for EU defence cooperation, and 54% said Ireland should be part of increased EU defence and security cooperation. So that's up 5% from the 2020 figure. I mean, should people who believe that Ireland's neutrality is perhaps outdated or no longer valid, if that's not the wrong word? Should people be encouraged by that, or how would you see that trend?
Well, yeah, I would hope that people recognize that, I mean, we understand the historical origins of our neutrality and why we are where we are today, but that actually we are heavily dependent on our European neighbors and on the United States for our security. And we can say we're neutral, but the practical reality is we are dependent on the NATO umbrella and that security architecture for our own future safety and security. And if we don't feel that we have to play any role in that or make any contribution to it, I once heard Helmut Kohl being asked in a meeting in the European Parliament by Joe McCartan about neutrality, and Helmut Kohl just looked at him and said, "For me, it's a moral issue. If you're comfortable that my son has to join the army and be sent off to fight for freedom in Europe, and you think you shouldn't, well, that doesn't bother me. But are you comfortable with it?" And I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves. Do we expect everyone else to do this, and somehow we don't have any role to play? Or do we feel we have a co-responsibility for managing the security in our own region?
Okay, thanks. Well, look, David, it is 22 minutes past 8. We were meant to wrap up at 8 o'clock. So I will just give you one final question, which popped into the chat there. And this was probably inevitable. I mean, just in terms of Brexit, we have seen the unfolding of the Brexit revolution, if that's what it is, over a 10, maybe 20-year period. The Conservatives have been in power since 2011. And after the election results last week, it doesn't look like they're leaving power anytime soon. Do you see a horizon for any re-entry of the United Kingdom, with or without Scotland, I should say, into the European Union? Or do you think that this bridge has been crossed definitively?
Well, I don't see any imminent prospect for all the reasons you've just given. I have not given up hope that at some point the British people might change their mind and once again rejoin the European project. I think the United Kingdom is part of Europe. I think the United Kingdom did contribute a lot, even if they were occasionally a difficult partner when we were in the European Union. British officials contributed hugely to the work of the institutions. I think it's a great loss. So a bit like Bobby McDonough, I think, who gave the Julian Priestley lecture and said, the dream lives on, or the hope lives on. I will never give up hoping that at some point we might be able to reverse that. But I'm a realist. I don't think it's useful to talk about it now. We're talking 10, 15, 20 years down the road sometime. And I think we should let the good people of the United Kingdom sort out their own internal business at this point. We should try to have the best possible relationship, but it won't be easy, because this is a government that has chosen the road of confrontation with the EU as a means of promoting domestic political support. So we're going to have to live with that. But personally, I will remain convinced that at some point, the United Kingdom, or whatever it looks like, whether it's still the United Kingdom, will rejoin the European project, because that is where they belong.
Well, as someone much wiser than me once said, if you don't believe in miracles, you're not a realist. So I think perhaps on that note, I would like to draw things to a close and to thank David O'Sullivan very much for what feels to me as a moderator like an exhausting tour through so many issues, local, national, and global. And it's a testimony to David that he has been able to answer such a range of questions in such great detail and with patience and tremendous insight. So I also would like to say that it's a fantastic inaugural launch of the Hume Foundation, and I think John Hume's legacy and his belief in and adherence to peace and reconciliation will be carried forth through events like this. So I would like to thank everybody for signing in. And sorry we didn't get to answer all of the questions. I would especially like to thank David O'Sullivan for a wonderful speech and Q&A session. It's been a pleasure and an honor to conduct it from here in Brussels. And the event itself will be available online on the Hume Foundation website. And I, for one, will look forward to next year's inaugural lecture on Europe and the spirit of peace. So from me, Tony Connelly in Brussels, thank you very, very much for joining us, and a very good night to everyone.
Thank you very much, and good luck to the foundation. Thank you. Thanks, Tony.